The morning the new housekeeper arrived at Renmore, the rain came sideways off the moor and turned the gravel drive to a dark river, and the woman who stepped down from the carrier's cart did not flinch at it. She had a plain gray cloak with a hem-worn pail at the edges, a single trunk roped shut with cord rather than leather straps, and a way of holding her chin that the footman at the door would later describe to the kitchen as proud in a manner he could not place. She gave her name to the steward as Mrs. Halloway. It was not the name she had been born with. The Duke of Ellesmere did not come down to greet her, for dukes did not greet housekeepers, and so she crossed his threshold unseen by the one man in England who had once known her face better than his own. He had been Captain Marcus Thorne then, before the title, before the war took his elder brother, and the gout took his father, and left him with 30,000 acres he had never wanted, and a house he could not bear to warm. 6 years had passed. She had counted them the way a prisoner counts the marks on a wall. Stay with me, because what this house had decided about the woman at its door was wrong in every particular, and you will see exactly how and exactly when the story is patient. So was she. Her real name was Eleanor Vane, and once she had worn silk the color of crushed apricots and danced 2 sets with a captain home on leave, who had looked at her as though she were the only fixed point in a turning room. Then her father's ships had gone down off the Barbary coast with the whole of the family fortune in their holds, and her father had followed them into the ground within the year, and the man she had been promised to, in all but writing, had been sent abroad by a regiment that did not ask his preference. Letters had been written. Letters had not arrived. Eleanor had learned slowly, and then all at once, that a woman with no money and no name worth marrying was a woman the world preferred not to see. She had taken work where work could be had. The deaf widow in Bath had been first, a Mrs. Quincy, who paid in lodging and small coin, and spoke loudly of her own former beauty, while Eleanor wound her wool and read her the same 3 novels by turns. There Eleanor had learned the first lesson of service, which was that a woman who depended on the goodwill of others must never appear to have a will of her own, and she had folded her own will up small and carried it where it could not be seen. When Mrs. Corbia Quincy died, Eleanor taught pianoforte to the daughters of a Bristol sugar merchant, 3 girls with stiff fingers and no ear, and their mother had watched Eleanor at the keys with a narrow look and dismissed her within the quarter. For the woman had seen that her husband's eye went to the governess in a way that flattered no one. That dismissal had taught the second lesson, which was that competence was not protection, that a woman with nothing could be turned out on a suspicion she had done nothing to earn. So she had gone at last into the housekeeper's trade, because a housekeeper at least was allowed to be competent in public, because the keys on the iron ring were a kind of authority no one could take by suspicion. She had not known the post was his. The advertisement had named only the house and the wage, and the requirement of a sober, experienced woman of mature good sense. Mature. She was 28. She had read the word, and laughed once, without warmth, and applied that same hour, because the wage was good, and Renmore was 4 counties from anyone who had ever called her by her first name. The housekeeper's rooms were 2 flights down from the family wing, and the keys came to her on an iron ring heavier than a Bible. The household had been running half-staffed and grief-shuttered for 3 years, and it showed in every dust-furred cornice and every fire laid wrong. Eleanor walked the rooms that first night with a candle and a list, and she saw at once what the trouble was. The trouble was that no one had been permitted to live in the house. The drawing-room shutters were nailed. The morning room held a pianoforte under a dust sheet, its lid shut, a single sheet of music left open on the stand as though someone had risen mid-phrase and never returned. She lifted the corner of the sheet and read the title and set it down again with care. The first time she saw him close was the 3rd morning in the long gallery, and she did not have the sense to be ready for it. He came around the turn of the corridor in his shirt sleeves, with a riding crop in one hand, and rain still in his dark hair, and she stepped back against the wall and dropped her eyes as a housekeeper should, and he stopped. He looked at her for the length of a held breath. Something moved behind his face. Some flicker she did not let herself read, and then it was gone, and he was the Duke of Ellesmere again. Gray eyes the color of smoke over slate, jaw set hard as the stone of his own house. "You are the new woman," he said. His voice was low and level, the words spaced as though he paid for each one. "Mrs. Halloway, your Grace." Her voice did not shake. She had practiced, not shaking for 6 years. He held her gaze a moment past what was comfortable. To the staff he was a cold man, and this was the proof of it, that he could look at a servant as though weighing her. And yet Eleanor felt the look land somewhere beneath her ribs, in a place she had bricked over and believed sealed, and her hand found the edge of a side table and steadied itself there without her permission. "You have made up fires in the family wing," he said. It was not a question. The house was cold, Your Grace. A cold house ruins itself faster than a warm one. He considered that. "No one has been in the morning room. I have not disturbed the morning room beyond the dust." She paused. "The pianoforte wants tuning. The damp has been at the felts." For a moment he said nothing at all. Then he turned and walked on, his boots loud on the boards, and he did not look back. And Eleanor stood in the gallery with her heart going like a struck drum and told herself it was only the cold. To the household below stairs, the new housekeeper was a puzzle they enjoyed solving wrongly. She knew French, the laundry maid reported, having heard her murmur over a torn letter. She held her fork like a lady. She had wept once, briefly, over a music sheet, and composed herself before anyone was meant to see. The cook, a broad, kind woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had been at Renmore 40 years, formed her own opinion and kept it. The steward, however, a thin, precise man named Mr. Bertas, Gott, who guarded his own small authority as a terrier guards a bone, decided early that Mrs. Halloway gave herself airs, and he said so to the under-butler over their evening ale. "A housekeeper and nothing more," he said. "For all she carries herself like a vicar's widow. She'll learn her station, or she'll learn the road." The words traveled, as words do. Eleanor heard them by the second week, repeated kindly by Mrs. Masta. Pruitt, who thought she ought to know, and she only nodded, and went on counting linen, for she had heard worse said of her in finer rooms by people in silk. The household had a fifth resident no one spoke of above a murmur, and Eleanor found her on the 4th day at the top of the house in a nursery with the curtains drawn. A child of perhaps 5 years sat on the floor among wooden soldiers, arranged in a line that never advanced, a small girl, with the Duke's dark hair, and a stillness no child should own. This was Lady Sophie, the only daughter of the Duke's late brother, orphaned at 3, and given to Renmore because there had been nowhere else, and tended by a nurse who drank and a governess who had given notice twice. The child did not speak. She had not spoken. Mrs. Pruitt said later, since the fever that took her mother, and the doctors had come from London and from York, and pronounced her sound in body, and lost in some way, they had no word for, and the Duke could not look at her without leaving the room. Eleanor knelt on the nursery floor in her good gray skirt, and did not touch the child, and did not speak to her either. She simply set a 6th soldier at the end of the line, a little apart, facing the others, and waited. After a long while the small girl moved it half an inch. It was not much. It was everything. Eleanor came back the next day, and the next, and she brought no demands and no pity, only her quiet presence. And once, low and unannounced, a few bars of an old nursery song hummed under her breath while she mended a torn sleeve. The child watched her mouth as though reading it. Eleanor learned the small geography of the nursery the way she had learned the house, by patience and by lamplight. She learned that the child would not be looked at directly, and so she looked at the soldiers instead, naming none of them, asking nothing. She learned that the nurse came up twice a day smelling of gin, and went away again without a word said between them, and Eleanor said nothing of that either, only began to come up at the hours the nurse did not, with a heel of warm bread in her apron pocket and a thimble and a basket of mending. so that the child grew used to the sound of a person who stayed. One afternoon she set out 2 cups from the nursery's old china, and poured nothing into them, and pushed one a half-inch toward the small girl and waited, and the child wrapped both hands around the empty cup and held it as though it were warm. Another afternoon the line of soldiers had grown a curve, a wall around the 6th soldier that Eleanor had set facing the rest, and Eleanor understood that the child had decided the one set apart was to be protected rather than shut out, and she had to bend over her mending a long moment before her eyes would behave. She never told the child she was clever. She never told the child anything. She only came, and stayed, and went away gently, and came again. What Eleanor did not know was that the Duke had come up the back stair that afternoon, as he sometimes did, to stand outside the nursery door, and listen to a silence he could not mend, and that he had heard the humming, and had heard his niece make a single small sound in answer, the first sound the child had offered the world in 2 years. He stood in the dark of the passage with his hand flat against the door, and did not go in. He did not trust what he had felt rise in his throat. He went down to his study and poured a brandy. He did not drink, and sat a long while in the dark. He began, after that, to find reasons. A duke does not seek out his housekeeper, but a duke may inquire about the management of his house, and so Eleanor was summoned to the study, to account for the spending of the quarter, and found him standing at the window with his back to her, and answered his questions in figures so exact that he turned to look at her halfway through. The study was the one warm room in his half of the house, the fire kept high, the desk a country of papers, and on the wall behind the desk a portrait hung, turned a quarter to the plaster so that the woman painted in it showed only the line of a cheek and an ear and a coil of dark hair. Eleanor did not look at it twice that day. She gave him the sums. He asked who had taught her to keep accounts. She said her father had valued an educated daughter, which was true, and did not say who her father had been, which was also a kind of truth. He let it pass. She saw him note it, though, file it. The way a man files a thing he means to take out later. As she gathered the ledgers to go, he said, not turning from the window, that the house was better run than it had been in his memory, and that he had not expected it. And the words came out of him stiff and unpracticed, the way a language comes that a man has not spoken in years. Eleanor said only that she was glad to give satisfaction, your grace, and went out and stood a moment in the cold corridor with the warm ledgers against her chest, and did not let herself name what the stiffness in his voice had done to her. You sit with my niece, he said when the accounts were done. Again, not a question. She does not mind me, your grace. The governess said she was beyond reaching. The governess, Eleanor said carefully, was perhaps reaching for the wrong thing. She had overstepped and knew it, and waited for the cold word that would put her back in her place. It did not come. He looked at her with those smoke-gray eyes for a moment longer than a master looks at a servant, and then he said, Lo, continue with her as you see fit. And that was the first command he gave her that was not a command at all, but a door held open, though neither of them named it so. The wider world arrived at Renmore in October in the person of the Dowager Countess of Asher, the Duke's aunt by marriage, who came with a maid and a mountain of trunks, and a clear understanding that her nephew had grieved long enough, and must now marry to secure the line. She brought with her, as one brings a parcel one intends to deliver, a young woman named Lady Caroline Frost, the daughter of an old friend, golden and poised, and 20, with a laugh, trained to carry across a drawing-room, and eyes that catalogued a house's worth in a single sweep. The dowager installed herself in the best guest rooms and began within a day to redecorate the household's understanding of itself. She found the housekeeper insolent. She said so to Lady Caroline over their morning chocolate, loudly enough that the maid would carry it, and the maid did. The woman looks one in the eye, the dowager said, as though she imagines herself a guest, a housekeeper and nothing more, and she would do well to remember it. I shall speak to Marcus about the staff, the whole house wants taking in hand. Eleanor, passing in the corridor with an armful of fresh candles, heard the second voicing of the label in the dowager's clipped consonants, and did not slow her step. Her face was warm, though, when she reached the still room, and she stood a moment with her palms flat on the cold marble counter, breathing, before she trusted her hands with the candles. The dowager's campaign was thorough. She wished the morning room reopened, the pianoforte uncovered, the house made fit for entertaining, for she meant to give a dinner, and then a ball, to show the county that Renmore lived again, and that its Duke was once more in the marriage market. Lady Caroline was given the run of the public rooms, and took to playing the uncovered pianoforte in the afternoons prettily and without feeling. The same 3 pieces over and over, and the Duke would come to the door and stand, and listen with a face like a shuttered window, and then go away again. It was Eleanor he came to find, though he would not have said so. He took to walking the East Terrace at the hour she aired the linen press in the room that gave onto it, and they fell into a habit of speech that was nothing, and was everything. A few sentences traded over the management of the house, the child, the coming frost. The first afternoon, it had been the weather and the chimneys. The second, it had been the child, and whether she ate, and Eleanor had told him plainly that the girl ate better when she was not watched, and he had taken that in with the small frown he wore when a thing he had assumed turned out to be wrong. The third afternoon, he had asked her almost against his own will what the song was that she hummed in the nursery, and she had told him it was one her own mother had sung, and he had stood a while looking out at the moor and said nothing. And she had understood that the answer had cost him something to hear. He told her one gray afternoon to stop carrying the heavy coal scuttles herself, that there were men for it. She said the men were wanted elsewhere, and she was stronger than she looked. He looked at her hands then, which were a lady's hands gone rough at the knuckles with work, and something tightened in his jaw. He said, his voice level, "Eat something, before you faint on my stairs and put me to the trouble of a doctor." She heard the command and answered it as a command with a level, "Yes, your grace," and turned back to the linen. Folded inside the order, where she did not let herself look at it, was a thing that was not an order at all. She felt it land somewhere beneath the brick, and hated herself a little for the warmth it lit, and pressed the warmth down the way she had learned to press her own will down small, and went on counting sheets until her hands were steady. Near the middle of all this, on a night when the wind came hard off the moor and the candles guttered in their sconces, Eleanor learned the shape of the Duke's grief, though he did not tell her in words. She had gone up to the nursery late, hearing the child cry out, and had found the Duke already there in the dark, kneeling by the small bed, with his hand hovering over his niece's hair, not touching, never quite touching, as though he believed his touch would harm. He did not hear Eleanor in the doorway. She heard him speak, very low, a name that was not the child's name. "Helene," he said at once, the way a man says a word he has not let himself say in years. Then he said to the sleeping child or to himself, "I will not fail you, as I failed her." And Eleanor understood. There had been a wife. There had been a Helene who had died while he was at war, alone in this cold house, and he had not been there. And he had decided in the iron way of grieving men that he was a man who failed the women in his keeping, and so he had stopped keeping any. She understood, too, in that doorway, the things she had marked without reading them. The portrait in the study that hung turned a quarter to the wall, so that the woman in it looked always away. The wing of rooms kept locked, where a maid had told her no one went, where the dust lay undisturbed as snow. The morning room with its nailed shutters and its pianoforte under its sheet, and its one sheet of music left open at the place, a hand had stopped. He had not closed the lid out of carelessness. He had closed the whole house out of penance. He kept the house cold so that nothing could thaw in it. He kept the child at arm's length, so he could not lose her up close. He had built himself a winter, and moved into it, and called it the least he owed the debt, and Eleanor, who had built her own cold rooms out of brick and grey wool in the folded-up small shape of her own will, knew the architecture of it from the inside, because she had been living in a house like his for 6 years. Eleanor withdrew without a sound. She did not speak of it. She began, after that night, to understand his coldness as a wound, dressing rather than a wound, and the understanding undid something in her that the bricks had been holding. If this story has reached the place in your chest where you hoped it would, you might tell me so, quietly, however you like. Then stay, because the hardest part is still coming. Eleanor did not yet know who she was sitting with, and he did not yet know who he was failing to recognize. The recognition, when it came by way of the child. Lady Sophie had begun to follow Eleanor through the house on silent feet, and one afternoon in the morning room, while Lady Caroline's sheet music lay abandoned on a chair, the child went to the covered pianoforte and laid her small hand flat upon the dust sheet and looked at Eleanor with a question her mouth could not make. Eleanor uncovered the keys. She had not played in 6 years. She sat, and she set her hands down, and she played the old piece that had been left open on the stand that first night. The piece she had recognized because she had once played it in a room full of candlelight, while a captain home on leave watched her from the doorway, and did not pretend to be doing anything else. She did not hear him come in. She was inside the music, which as a country a person can disappear into, and when she came back to herself, the last chord was dying in the air, and the Duke of Ellesmere was standing 6 feet away with the strangest expression she had ever seen on a human face. He was white, he was looking at her hands, and then at her face, and then at her hands again, as though the two did not agree. The child had gone very still on the bench beside her, watching the 2 grown people the way she watched the soldiers, gravely, as though something were being decided that she had no power over, and every stake in. "Where?" he said, and stopped. His voice was not level now. "Where did you learn that?" "My father had it taught to me, Your Grace." The lie was thin, and she knew it was thin. "No." He came a step closer. The child looked between them. "I have heard that played once, in my life, by a woman in an apricot gown at the Hartfield ball 6 years ago, who promised me the next set, and then her family was ruined, and she vanished off the face of the earth, and I came home from Spain to find her gone, and no one who would tell me where." "Ed!" He was close now. His hand rose as though to touch her face and stopped, hovering the same way it hovered over the child, a man who had taught himself not to touch the things he feared to break. "Eleanor," he said. "Not Mrs. Holloway. Eleanor." The name went through her like the first warmth after frostbite, which is to say it hurt. She stood. The bench scraped. "I did not know the house was yours," she said, and it was the truest thing she had said in 6 years. The advertisement gave only the house and the wage. "I came 4 counties to be no one. Your Grace and I have been very good at it." Her voice held until the last words, and then thinned. "I would not have come. I could not have borne for you to find me a servant. I could not have borne to be a thing you pitied, when once I had been a thing you looked at as though I mattered. So I changed my name, and I kept your fires, and I told myself it was enough to be near the warmth, without asking to be let in. You think that is what I see." It was not a question either, but it was nearer than any question. For one moment, the shuttered window of his face stood open, and she saw the whole long 6 years of his side of it. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor, the dowager's voice, and he stepped back and the window closed, and he said, "Only, we will speak. Not here." And he left her standing with the child's hand creeping into hers. The dowager was not a fool, whatever else she was. She had seen her nephew's face go strange whenever the housekeeper was in her room, and she made her inquiries. And a woman with a maid and 40 years of practice can learn a great deal. By the night of the ball she had learned enough. She did not learn it kindly. She learned it as ammunition. The ball was given in the long saloon, the same room with the same chandelier, under which in another life Eleanor had been a girl with a future. The county came, in its diamonds and its expectation. Lady Caroline wore ice blue and stood at the dowager's right hand, where a chosen bride should stand. And Eleanor, who had no business at a ball, was kept below directing the supper and the wine until the dowager sent a footman down with a request, delivered as a courtesy and meant as a blade, that Mrs. Holloway come up and account for a missing case of the good claret in front of the assembled guests. It was a trap, and Eleanor walked into it with her chin up, because she had learned long ago that you cannot dodge a blade aimed at your dignity. You can only refuse to bleed where they can see. She had been in the cellar with the under-butler not an hour before, counting the very claret in question, and she knew to the bottle where it stood. The missing case was no more missing than the moon. She understood, climbing the back stair with the footman's summons still in her ear, that the claret was only the doorway, and the room beyond was meant for something else. She might have refused to come. A housekeeper summoned before guests had grounds to send word that she would attend the matter privately in the morning. She did not send word. She had spent 6 years being moved quietly out of rooms before anyone need be troubled by her. And she found, climbing those stairs, that she had no more retreat left in her. She came up the stairs in her good gray gown among the silks and the diamonds, and the room turned to look at her. The saturated luxury of it pressing in from every side, the chandelier she had once stood beneath as a girl with a future throwing its light down on her plain hem and her work-roughened hands, and the dowager's voice rang out clear and pleased. There she is. Now. Perhaps the housekeeper will explain to us all where the claret is gone, and while she is about it, perhaps she will explain why a woman of no family and no name, a housekeeper and nothing more, has been making free of my nephew's private rooms, and his private music, and his ward. We are all very curious. She let the silence stretch. Some of us know what to call a woman who attaches herself to a grieving man's household. I shall be charitable and call her dismissed. The third voicing landed in the largest room of all, in front of the most people, and it was meant to end her. Eleanor stood in the center of the turning room and felt the old shame rise, and felt, underneath it, something steadier, the thing the bricks had been built to protect. She did not weep. She looked at the dowager and said in a voice that carried, "Because she did not raise it, I have made free of nothing, my lady. The claret is in the second cellar, where the under-butler moved it from the damp, and I will show the steward directly. As for the rest, I have given this house my work, and the child my care, and have asked for nothing. You may call that what you like. You are not the first to choose the wrong word for me." And then the door at the end of the saloon opened, and the Duke of Ellesmere came in. He had been with his solicitor, who had arrived that afternoon on a matter the dowager did not know of, and he came into the room still drawing off his gloves. And he took in the scene in a single sweep, the housekeeper at the center, the diamonds ringing her, his aunt's hand raised, Lady Caroline in ice blue, the whole machinery of the verdict at its work. The music had stopped. No one had told it to. He crossed the long floor, and the crowd parted for him because crowds always parted for him. And he did not stop until he stood at Eleanor's side, between her and his aunt, and turned to face the room. The silence was complete. End quote. Even the candles seemed to hold still. "This is Miss Eleanor Vane," he said. "I am going to marry her." 8 words. The room did not breathe. The dowager's hand, raised to make some final point, hung in the air, and then came down to grip the back of a chair, and her mouth opened and shut, and the polished sentences she had carried all her life would not assemble. Lady Caroline went very pale and very still, and then, to her own credit, looked less wounded than relieved, as a person looks when a weight they did not choose is lifted. A murmur began at the edges of the room, and the solicitor stepped forward into the doorway with a folded paper in his hand, and the Duke said, without turning, "Mr. Albury has this evening drawn the settlements. The thing is done in law, as it is done in fact." Then he looked at no one but Eleanor. She was trembling. She had braced for the blade, and not for this. And the body that had known the truth for weeks now caught up with her mind all at once, and her hand rose to her mouth. He took her other hand in both of his there in front of the county, and he did not make a speech, because he had said the only thing that needed saying. "You found my house cold," he said, low for her and not for them, though they all heard it. "You should not have had to warm it alone." The dowager left Renmore within the week. She was not destroyed, and she was not cast out. She was simply, quietly, no longer the authority in that house. And she knew it, and she went to Bath where authorities of her kind are received. There was a last interview between aunt and nephew in the study on the morning of her going, brief and behind a closed door. And what passed in it no one heard, but the dowager came out with her chin high and her color up and gave her orders for the trunks in a voice that had lost some certainty it had carried in. And as she went down the steps to her carriage, she paused once and looked back at the house, at the open shutters and the smoke standing up warm from every chimney, and something crossed her face that was not anger. She had protected an order all her life. She had not understood that the order had been protecting a tomb. Lady Caroline went with her and was by spring engaged to a baronet of her own choosing, which suited her better than a grieving duke ever would have. And she wrote Eleanor a short civil note of congratulation that was kinder than it needed to be. Mr. Galt the steward, who had been first to say the word, found himself answering now to a mistress he had wished gone, and discovered her fair and exact and disinclined to remember the word against him, and slowly, in the manner of small proud men given no grievance to feed, he came round. The county talked for a season, and then found other things to talk of, as the county does. Thank you for staying with Eleanor to the end. If her story warmed a cold place, you will know which one. The frost came hard that December, and the house at Renmore was warm all through it. Every fire laid right, every shutter open to the snow. On Christmas Eve, in the morning room that no longer held a dust sheet, a small fire snapped in the grate, and the long windows showed the snow coming down soft over the moor, and Eleanor sat at the pianoforte with Lady Sophie beside her on the bench. The child had a word now, a few words. One back slowly across the autumn, the way feeling comes back to a cold hand, in pins and aches, and then in warmth. She had asked, that afternoon, in a small, rusty voice, for the song. The Duke stood by the window with his hand, resting easy on the frame, not braced against it, only resting, and he watched his wife and his niece at the keys. Eleanor played the old piece, the one left open on the stand the night she came, and this time there was no dust sheet, and no 6 years of silence, and no captain in a doorway, pretending not to watch. There was only a man who watched openly now, and a child who hummed the melody half a beat behind, and the snow, and the fire, and the warm yellow room holding all of it like a cupped hand. On the music stand, where once a single abandoned sheet had marked the place, a person rose and never came back. The same sheet stood open, its corner soft with handling. The last chord settled into the room and did not die so much as rest. Outside the long windows, the snow went on, falling over Renmore, covering the cold ground, and inside, no one was cold at all.